Bună ziua și iată-mă la Bacău. Iată-mă la Bacău într-un spirit de prietenie și de înțelegere și de solidaritate, bineînțeles, pe niște repere culturale. Eu sunt Cleopatra Lorințiu și ca să mă prezint în exact 10 cuvinte, sunt poetă, sunt prozatoare, am fost jurnalistă vreme de 10 de ani, am lucrat film documentar și am făcut mai multe lucruri la viața mea. De curând am scos o carte care se numește După amiaza vieții, care abia a ieșit pe piață și în această carte aduc un tribut oamenilor pe care i-am întâlnit. Pentru că eu cred că este foarte important să nu uităm marile întâlniri ale vieții. Fără să exagerez, aceasta este o mare întâlnire a vieții. Venirea mea la Bacău, întâlnirea cu colectivul de la Centru de Cultură George Apostu, dirijat cu atâta înțelegere și cu atâta dăruire de domnul Gheorghe Geopopa, pe care l-am cunoscut acum mai bine de 40 de ani, când însuși evolua pe scena teatrului din Bacău, unde erau piese de teatru despre care eu, tânără cronicară, în anii 80 scriam. Deci iată-mă la Centrul de Cultură George Apostu, împreună cu echipa dumisale, care ne-a ajutat mult în întreprinderea despre care vă vom vorbi astăzi în acest podcast, la Vedere, la Bacău în acest podcast, și înregistrând aceste vorbe într-o dimineață în fabulosul loc al studioului lui Ovidiu Ungureanu, artistul vizual, prietenul, omul pe care îl prețuiesc enorm și care pentru mine este un adevărat frate într-o arte vizuale, într-o cultură, solidaritate și prietenie, și colegii lui care îl ajută. Așadar, de ce suntem la Bacău? Suntem la Bacău pentru că împreună cu curatoarea Vela Pilpul din Israel am curatoriat, o să ziceți ce treabă am eu cu curatoriatul, am curatoriat expoziții de artă plastică la Tel Aviv, pe când lucram și eu într-o instituție culturală care reprezenta cultura României în Israel, și acum, după ce sunt la București, am continuat împreună cu Vela Pilpul să aducem artiști israelieni în România și să-i găzduim așa cum se cuvine, în expoziții care să fie un pod de prietenie între culturi. Anul trecut am fost aici și la Bistrița cu Schuli Borstein Wolf, o expoziție bazată pe interpretarea materialelor reciclate, o expoziție provocatoare și interesantă. De asta dată avem o invitată de excepție, zic eu, și îmi cumpănesc cuvintele. Este vorba despre doamna Beverley Jane Stewart. Dumneaei ne-a onorat cu prezența. Curatoriem tot împreună cu Vela Pilpul această expoziție, care are loc sub egida Centrului de Cultură George Apostu. Este o expoziție de călătorie în timp. Este o călătorie în ideea de moștenire culturală. Este o călătorie demnă de emoție, de nostalgie, în care tehnica artei plastice și un anume fel de a desena și de a picta se îmbină cu istoria, dar se îmbină cu o istorie filtrată printr-o sensibilitate afectivă, printr-o afinitate electivă pe care artista o are. Deci acum vă prezint pe doamna Beverley Jane Stewart, invitata a podcastului și deci astăzi la Vedere pentru cei care ne urmăriți, începând cu astăzi ne urmăriți, dar sper că veți rămâne prietenii noștri. Hi, Beverley Jane Stewart.
Hi.
You are our guest here in Bacău.
Yeah.
Not first time in Romania, but
No.
first time in Bacău.
No, it's not actually the first time in Bacău.
Yes,
no,
yes,
it's the second
yeah,
time.
this is interesting for starting our little discussion
Yes,
today.
yes.
Tell us about your relation with our country. I don't want to tell so many secrets to our public.
Well,
Let me know.
I have Romanian roots.
Yes.
And I come from a very artistic background. My aunts were all artists. I was filled with art in my home, in my grandparents' home, but I never felt somehow connected with the world around me outside. When I went into my home, it was like in a private cave with all this creativity. And as I grew older, I wanted to know a bit more about myself. Where was this art coming from? Why was it so strong? Why everywhere around me was beautiful carvings and beautiful tapestries? And when we wore anything, everybody had to pass it. You know, you look smart. No, the skirt's the wrong length. Why was this importance on the physical presentation? And as I developed as an artist and I was interested in society and what makes people click, I'm interested in characterizations. I then looked at my own characterization. What had created me? And when I start looking at people, and I was a teacher in very, very difficult areas of London, and when you have a class full of children, and often disturbed children, 40 children in your class, they don't want you, but you have to have them. And you've got to make them listen to you. And how are you going to do it? So I studied psychology in education, and I was a teacher, and it made me again think about what made people's personalities, what made people who they are, and why do they express themselves as they do. And then something which is very prevalent in my work is about identity. And we all have an identity, and our identity is formed through our history. We all own a history. It's very different. You can't get rid of that history. You can accept it, you can adapt it, you can reject it, but it does define who we are, and especially in the early years. And through my psychology and my teaching, that became very important to understand the children, how I'm going to persuade those children to trust me, to listen to my class, and when they finish with me, they've gained something in their education. And that worked into my artwork. And then I started my own roots. And then I thought, you know what? There's so much art in my family, and it's from a Romanian background. My father's side was Polish, but the evidence from the maternal side was more from my mum. Both my parents were artistic. My father was a fashion designer, was very high up in the fashion world. And my mother was an antique dealer. So I was brought up with the old and the new and the fashion. And
everywhere the art was important.
Very, yeah.
Yes.
And there was another thing that happened in my childhood that influenced me a lot, and you'll see it in my art, is I was very unhappy at school. Very, very unhappy. I didn't fit. I was a round peg in a square hole, but that's what people say. And I then went into myself. When you go into yourself, you start the imagination. And my imagination from my loneliness in my childhood, because I wasn't friendly with my school kids, I was bullied, I was odd, I was different. I had my dolls, and my dolls became characters. And I still remember the names of my dolls and the characters that I gave them. And if you look at my artwork, at the figures, they become my dolls. So I create, when I see people in the street, the people that I imagine, and the friendships and the characters, and they become my companions. And my art is like my friends. I create these characters. And of course, my teaching experience of being able to connect with different characters comes into my work.
You told us yesterday evening during the opening here in 𝐸𝐞𝐞 something very, very special. I was on the point to cry. You said, my parents leave the country, Romania, by fear, and I return with courage. It's incredible.
That's what I feel. I felt when I first decided to do this project, you know, there was always this fear in our home. We didn't talk a lot about Romania, though I was aware of this tremendous art. And it was very much, I came from an era where you had to be English. You had to adapt to the culture you were in. and forget your history. And I could not, I because of the psychology and my knowledge, I couldn't see where this growth had developed from, because this was a growth. This wasn't something that was implanted or imposed. It was a natural growth that had developed in my family and my aunts. And I decided that I was going to go back to my roots. Now, I had 2 uncles. My uncle only died last year, who was 102. And he said to me, why? Why do you want to go back all those years and look where your grandparents came from? Why? What was the point? We've got a new life, new culture. And I said, but there's no foundation. You were floating in the middle of the air. And there was a fear of going back. You think of the Pongons. My grandparents left Romania. They were wealthy people, and they left all their money in Botoșani. They came into Britain penniless. They were able to loan some money. My grandfather, who was a sculptor, opened up a factory of making carvings for furniture. And then there was a fire and you couldn't get insurance, so he lost everything. So I knew what life was like with nothing through my parents. And when you have nothing, you create. And there was again the stemming of creation. So I wanted to go back and I wanted to see where they came from.
This is good to say this to the new generation. This example.
Yeah. Well, I don't, as I started before, you can't break away from who you are. You have a history and and it's usually quite interesting. When I was in England, there was a political situation with Black Lives Matter, and I think it's a very important political statement. And they were smashing up statues because people had given money through the slave trade. And I felt, people come from that background. Look where you are now. Look what you've achieved. Look what you are as a person. And even in that situation, even when you were the lowest of the lowest, you had companionship, you had music, you sung together. Take the positive and be proud of it. Yes. And I look at that in everybody. I like to think of that little spark, it develops. And when I went to Botoșani, back to my roots, I didn't expect to see anything. I had a few postcards from relatives that lived in Botoșani that had sent them to my grandparents. And I saw the municipality from well before the war, and I put that into my picture. And I saw a few of the old buildings that were still there, which is lovely when you see, buildings and their architecture tell you the history as well. It gives a structure to a place. So it had a connection. I had something concrete to hold on to. And then I went into the synagogue. There's only one synagogue left in Botoșani. But then I looked at the ceiling, and then there was all these animals. Now, I've been to the synagogue now in Baku. Again,
yes, by the way, animals. We were together yesterday in the synagogue
of
Baku.
This part of the area is not in Bucharest. They're much more geometrical, the designs. And my grandmother was always doing tapestries with animals. So suddenly I saw, and the richness of the colour was coming through. And then I went to the cemetery of my ancestors, and then I had a bigger shock. Because the stones, the gravestones, the carvings in the gravestone, the style of the carvings was the same style that my grandfather had done in his sculpture. And now I started seeing a thread between his life and his culture coming through the art to me in Britain, in quite a few generations on. And I feel that that's a beautiful legacy, just a beautiful legacy that I've got the art, and my children now, some of them are artistic, some of them are not so artistic, but at least they're aware of it. I don't think anybody should be ashamed of their history. Sometimes it's out of your control, but it's it has a part of the jigsaw, and we don't always like the jigsaw, and sometimes we do. But try and look at the good part of that jigsaw, and try and make that part of you.
Speaking about this positive feeling, what was your state of mind and emotional mood yesterday during the opening and during this meeting with 𝐸𝐸 public and people?
I felt very humble, actually. Really humble.
I didn't expect this, but
I
tell
felt
us.
humble. You know, people
Yeah.
have this vision with artists. That you're somebody grand, and you know, you've got these ideas in your head, and you produce it and you show it off. But in fact, for me, it's not like that at all. I sit there in my little studio and in my imagination. And
Yeah.
sometimes I'm not even in the country I'm in another country in my head. And I think to myself, why would people want to know what's in my head? Why would people be interested in what's in my head? And people really, you know, you go to dinner parties and that, and on the whole, people want to talk about themselves. They don't really want to engage. And if they do engage, they don't engage with empathy. So you listen. I'm a person that listens and watches, and I try to understand people's characters, and I fold myself into the situation. But to come into a gallery like yesterday, or a museum, and your work's on that wall, and you know you've created it in your head and in your studio and in your imagination and in your experiences, and they want to share that, that's terribly humbling.
Well,
You know, I feel very, you know, I feel quite tearful that people want to even listen or appreciate it. You know, it's something very special. And when people do, I think that's very kind of them. And I appreciate it for their
it's
kindness.
so touching that you said we are in a journey in time. Even here in this studio, with these objects who are around, it's amazing, this place, yes. It will be something for your memory.
I love this place. I walked into this place and I thought to myself, oh my God, this is my world. As I said, my mother was an antique dealer. I love going to car boot sales. I love creating my own jewelry. I collect plastic beads. I make things. You know, I love things that have a history to it. You know, that jar has been from one place to another place, and somebody's actually made that jar. It hasn't gone necessarily through a factory. You know, or somebody's put it on their shelf and they've actually appreciated that jar. You know, everything has a life. Even though it's not a pulsing life or a human life or an active life, it still has a life because it's been created.
Let's tell to our friends from 𝐸𝐸 that we have plans for the future. Avem și alte planuri pentru viitor, vi le vom dezvălui cu timpul. Pentru astăzi, sper că v-am prilejuit o întâlnire emoționantă și un îndemn să nu ne uităm trecutul, să nu ne uităm rădăcinile, să pozitivăm și să ne gândim că arta și cultura este ceea ce ne susține. Before leaving you, I want to tell us something about your work and a message for the new generation. Why not?
Well, my newer is something that's more different, but it deals with identity. And I'm looking not so much my own identity and my own history, but looking at immigration generally and how people have evolved and brought their culture into another culture. So I'm looking at the slave trade, I'm looking at the Windrush, I'm looking at the history of the Bangladesh world in Britain. So I'm moving more at the moment into the British world, though I hope to carry this theme into the States and compare it with immigration in the States. And when you go to the ports, in Britain this is, we now have the world of the commercial world, the banking world. And I call it the glass city. Everywhere there's glass, there's reflections, and it's very light and very bright. But the old world has begun to be demolished. The old communities, little houses together, it's all become sort of impersonalized, and people have to be functional and fit into these sort of hard lines, and losing, in some ways, individuality. And what I'm doing in my new work is make people looking beyond and in between the glass buildings and the modern factories and the modern banks, and look how the history evolved, how these ports developed, and how people have come in and the history they brought in, and look at the music, and look at our food, and look at our fashion. And this has happened because of the evolving of populations. So I would say to the new generation that you're not on your own. You might be young and new, but you're not on your own. Things happen in layers. And what you are now has happened from layers. And see if you can find the layers in between modernity. And that perhaps gives you a feeling of connection and identity and belonging, even if you've come from one country to another. I hope that is an inspirational message.
Thank you.